Most people are willing to acknowledge that work relationships are transactional, which is to say, you apply for a job, let's say you get the job, and you do work for your employer in the expectation that you get paid. If you perform well, you probably will get paid and perhaps even get a raise. If you perform poorly, eventually they will fire you. You will be let go. And most people understand that and probably don't really have a problem with it. Where it gets tricky, however, in human interactions is personal relationships, whether they're romantic, friendship, or even familial. So, of course, in the working world, not a problem. In most settings, not a problem, even if it's not exactly about money. So, for example, a doctor who doesn't do well, engages in malpractice, he will be, quote unquote, fired from his job because there's a transactional expectation there that he does his work properly and that he heals or helps people. But what about the relationship, say, between siblings, right? Is there not an expectation on some level that because they're siblings, they should just get along swimmingly, that there should be no problems between them? In an ideal world, that would be the case, or the interaction between a parent and his or her child, right? Because blood relations, no transaction there, though therein lies the rub. In the case of family, blood relations is precisely the price of the transaction. You do all kinds of things for people related to you, more closely related, likely the greater output of your work that you're willing to invest in said people, because they are blood relations. That is the price of the transaction. The same is true of friendship, tit for tat. Now, where the rubber really meets the road here, because blood relations, genes, relatedness, okay, fair enough. People would say, well, family relations, relatedness, blood, genes, whatever. Okay, that's not really a transaction. I would disagree. But nonetheless, let's say they're right. The real issue is when it comes to relationships, romantic relationships. As many people have pointed out, they are pretty brutal, right? They're not easy things. And the reality of them is that they function in a similar way to your work relationships. When you're trying to enter into a relationship, the other person effectively is the employer and you're the employee. And sometimes the roles are reversed. Sometimes you're both employees. But considering the fact that liking someone or being interested in someone is rarely, if ever, evenly distributed, I would say that, well, it's usually employer versus employee. So you have to make your bid. You have to show off your credentials. What are these credentials? Obviously, looks. Look as good as possible if you're lucky and capable of doing so. Those are the universals that exist between men and women. And then after that, if you're a man, the usual shit. Have status, make good money, dress well, blah, blah, blah. If you're a female, don't be fat. That's part of looks. And just be pleasant and nice. That's usually enough for a female. Look good, be pleasant and nice, and then that's it. And there are a bunch of other things, just common interests, etc., but that's all tertiary or quaternary, however you want to put it. It's way, way back there compared to the other stuff in terms of passing certain tests. Looks test, status test, do you get along on a very, very basic human level? So similar to a job. Okay, you get into a relationship. You got the job, right? What happens then? Well, a lot of people forget, unlike at a job, that relationships, romantic relationships, are just as transactional as work. So at work, if you get a job and you have a so-called honeymoon phase, this is not actually what happens, but you work really hard for the first half year and then just slack off and do nothing, they might give you one chance, but eventually they're going to fire you, right? That's how it would work in a workplace environment. How does that work in a relationship? Well, problems arise, right? Not too dissimilar to the employer-employee situation. If, for example, you got into a relationship, you put your best foot forward and you dressed really nicely, you look good, you were slim, blah, 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 all this stuff. You worked hard to show off your status, your money, and then half a year in, you let yourself go. That's a problem. And the employer, who usually is the woman, let's be honest. Let's be perfectly honest here. The woman is usually the employer in the relationship. She determines whether or not she's into you or not. Women end most marriages, although the stats are not as clear in terms of relationships. Some people argue 50-50. I would argue a lot of relationships on average are ended on more frequently by women. So she's the employer, and you've decided to let yourself go. Well, not that great. She will probably start monkey branching. She'll start looking for other options because, again, in a relationship, it's not too dissimilar to having a job. It can be at times not just as stressful, but even more stressful because at the very least, for the most part, work is something that you can leave behind at the office if you're working that type of job, obviously. In terms of women, that's not the case. You're in a relationship. The terror that ensues in a relationship can follow you for perpetuity, in theory. So people forget this frequently. They forget that relationships are just as transactional. You need to offer the goods in much the same way that you need to offer high quality work to an employer to make sure that he keeps you employed, keep on getting paid. You ever talk to normies about this? It doesn't work. Because normies are stuck in lovey-dovey, fuddy-wuddy, sucky-wucky world where love is this magical thing and romantic relationships are this magical thing. And there isn't any price to be paid for it. There is no transaction. It's just fuzzy feelings, right? This is part and parcel of one of the reasons why relationships these days are just so bloody dysfunctional. Because nobody bears in mind that relationships are just as transactional as your workplace job, right? The expectations are somewhat different at times. In fact, I'd argue in many cases the expectations are far greater. At your job, you might be expected to perform 2 or 3 tasks at most, and that's enough. In a relationship, especially with a woman, you are performing round the clock. You need to look good. You need to earn your money. You need to work hard, but you also have to have time for her. You need to do all these things in order to stay, quote unquote, employed. And even then, it's no guarantee. In fact, if you're performing decently to above average to well at your workplace, you probably have a higher likelihood of not getting sacked or losing the job than you would in a relationship, because relationships are, unfortunately, oftentimes very random. People enter in them, think, oh, fuzzy wuzzy will carry me the whole way, and then what happens? Fuzzy wuzzy feelings fail. And this runs, of course, into extreme conflict with the view that human beings at base are not transactional, that we just kind of get along. We're not in a tit-for-tat relationship with each other. It flies in the face of all the white lies and pretensions that normies have about the world we live in. Of course, they're full of feces, but they don't want to know. But relationships are brutal. You have to maintain certain standards in a way that is very similar to work, only even more demanding in many cases, because it's basically a 24/7 job versus the job that you do at your workplace. You go home, you play your Xbox, whatever. It's a different situation. The irony here is that people, normies especially, would probably benefit from this awareness of the transactional nature of human relationships because they might be able to do the quote-unquote right things in order to maintain them. For example, people letting themselves go once they pass the honeymoon phase, allowing themselves to get too accustomed to certain things, happens very frequently. And then typically you're in for a mean surprise when the other person decides to ditch you. So from a pragmatic perspective, can we transcend the transactional? No. We can pretend to. We can make stories up. We can lie to ourselves and to other people. But the reality is we cannot transcend it, cannot circumvent it. So it's better to be aware of this stuff. It's better to be hyper aware of the transactional nature of relationships. People then argue, oh, that puts a relationship in a lot of tension. It's stressful. Yeah, well, guess what? Relationships are stressful and full of tension. That's what they are. They're rarely just chill sessions, maybe in the very beginning of the honeymoon phase with the fuzzy-wuzzy butterflies. But apart from that, not really. Relationships, and marriage especially, are jobs. And the question is, do you want that job? Well, you need a job to pay the rent, to pay your bills, pay for food, etc., etc. What are you getting out of a relationship? Well, you're not necessarily getting paid, unless you're a woman, of course, in which case many times you will be paid effectively to be in a relationship. But that's the question. If it is all transactional, which it is the juice worth the squeeze? Is it worth having a second job that never ceases, unlike the 9-to-5 that you might be pulling in your day-to-day life? That's for each individual man to decide, but I think having the cards clearly laid out on the table will help you make that decision. in a far better fashion than the normie sentimentality about relationships that just doesn't accord with reality, frankly speaking. If you ignore the transactional is going to come home and kick you in the butt. Anyways, always thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, share, comment, subscribe. Really helps out the channel. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. Take care. Until the next time, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.